Okay, so this time you've really given us something pretty unique to dive into.
Yeah.
It all starts with this really strange rumor about a missing chapter
Oh,
on the devil. Spinoza, the champion of reason and logic,
right.
supposedly wrote about the devil.
That's kind of funny.
Yeah, it's almost like finding out your super logical friend believes in Bigfoot or something like that.
It really is, right?
It's really strange.
I mean, from the very beginning, it's just fascinating to see how these kind of sensational details
Yeah.
can sometimes just completely overshadow what the real story is
Right.
and what the actual intellectual work is.
Exactly. Yeah.
This whole thing about the missing devil chapter is such a good example of how narratives can get twisted
Right.
and how they can take on a life of their own.
Absolutely. So what we're really digging into here is the story behind a work by Spinoza called the Breve tratado de Deus, do homem e do seu bem-estar,
Okay.
which translates to short treatise on God, man, and his well-being. And the sources that you've given me lay out this incredible journey, like from these maybe informal explorations of his ideas
I see.
to its eventual recognition as, really important piece in understanding his whole philosophical system.
Right.
Like we get to peek behind the curtain and see how this philosophical masterpiece developed.
Yeah, and I think if we kind of zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture,
Right.
this deep dive is really getting at something very fundamental about philosophy,
Yes.
It's about how these ideas manage to survive over time,
Right.
how they get rediscovered and how they're interpreted.
Right.
The fact that we're even having this discussion
Exactly.
about a work that was considered lost, potentially a minor work by someone as influential as Spinoza,
Right.
really shows how powerful his thinking was and still is.
Absolutely. And so today, our mission is to sort of act like these philosophical detectives.
Okay.
We want to try and figure out how the Breve Tratado came to light.
Right.
All the arguments about whether it was really Spinoza's work, and most importantly for you, the listener, why this brief treatise is so important for understanding Spinoza's philosophy,
I see.
especially when we compare it to his much more famous ethics.
Okay. Yeah.
Think of it like an origin story for some of Spinoza's biggest ideas.
Okay. Yeah.
And your main source, the Breve Tratado itself, gives a really detailed historical account of this whole process,
Oh, interesting.
which we'll be looking at pretty closely today.
Yeah, so let's get into that whole initial confusion then.
Right.
This rumor about the devil, like, how did this all even come about?
Well, it seems like it all stems back to these early accounts of the ethics.
Okay.
Picture this. Two booksellers, Stoll and Hallman, they're trying to gather info on Spinoza.
Right.
They're talking to Jan Ruerts' son, who was Spinoza's publisher.
Okay.
And Ruerts' son, he mentions this.
What's that?
That the manuscript for the ethics actually had a 21st chapter
Oh, wow.
on the devil, but it didn't end up in the published Latin version. So this little piece of information, it starts to spread.
Yeah.
And these German editors, they kind of jump the gun
Right.
and they assume that this Dutch ethics was an early version
Okay.
of the Latin ethics.
Got it.
And they think all they have to do is find this missing chapter, publish it, and they'll have the complete ethics.
Interesting.
But of course, the chapter is nowhere to be found.
Right.
But for some reason, the manuscript itself starts being called the Treatise on the Devil.
It's just a classic case, isn't it? Of
See-
a rumor just taken off.
Exactly. It's like a snowball effect.
It's so interesting how that happens, It's almost like there's this inherent assumption, right?
Yeah.
That anything discussed in Dutch must have been sort of a preliminary version.
Right. Yeah.
Leading up to the more formally published Latin ethics,
Right.
which really highlights how the language that a philosopher uses and, how their
Yeah.
work gets published really shapes how we understand their whole intellectual journey.
Absolutely. Really colors how we view it.
Right, exactly.
So now fast forward to 1851. We meet this German scholar, Boehmer.
Okay.
While he's in Amsterdam, he finds something pretty important.
Oh,
A handwritten copy of Caleris's biography of Spinoza.
okay.
But it wasn't just a regular copy. It had a few really interesting things in it.
Like what?
Spinoza's own annotations to his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus,
Wow.
and two other really key pieces.
Okay.
A nota, which basically hints that there's this unknown Spinoza manuscript out there,
Interesting.
and a Compendio Breve, which is like a short summary of what's in this manuscript.
So Boehmer's discovery is really what changes things, right?
Yeah.
We go from just rumors and hearsay
Yeah.
to actual evidence
Right.
that this other work by Spinoza might actually exist.
Yeah, and that Nota in particular had some really important clues in it. Right?
Oh, absolutely. So tell me about that.
Well, the Nota described this manuscript
Yes.
that had a lot of the same core ideas as the ethics,
Yeah.
but it presented them in this less formal way without using the geometric method.
I see.
And it specifically mentioned that this manuscript seemed to be an earlier exploration of those ideas,
Interesting.
almost like a first draft, before Spinoza got into the more rigorous structure of the ethics.
So kind of like a testing ground?
Yeah, exactly, like a rough sketch of the ideas.
Yeah.
What's even more intriguing is that the Nota said that only the appendix
Okay.
in this manuscript and only the beginning of the appendix
Right.
used the geometric method,
Okay.
which meant that the rest of it was potentially much easier to understand
Right.
than the ethics, which is known for being really complex and dense.
It's famously difficult, right?
Yes, very much so.
So that's a big deal.
Yeah.
If this manuscript is laying out those same ideas,
Yeah.
but in a more accessible way,
Exactly.
that's huge.
And it also confirmed that Spinoza's notes on the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus existed,
Right.
which was a big discovery on its own. So Boehmer was really excited about this.
Understandably so.
In 1852, he publishes the Compendio Breve.
Okay.
What's his initial take on all this new information?
Yeah, what does he make of it?
Well, based on what he read in the Nota and the summary,
Yeah.
Boehmer thought that this manuscript was an early attempt by Spinoza, maybe from around 1661,
Okay.
and that it showed how Descartes influenced his thinking.
That's an interesting
He
connection.
even suggested that the geometric appendix in this manuscript
Yeah.
was similar to those early propositions that Spinoza had sent to Henry Oldenburg.
Interesting.
So Boehmer is really the first one to try and pinpoint when Spinoza might have written this mysterious manuscript.
Right. He's trying to place it within Spinoza's timeline.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's more to the story, though, right?
Oh, definitely.
This isn't the end of the mystery.
Not even close.
Right. So what happens next?
So then comes Johannes von Vloten.
Okay.
He's a really important figure in Spinoza scholarships. He decides to put together a supplement to Spinoza's collected works
Oh,
with the aim of including this unknown manuscript.
Right.
So he teams up with this bookseller, Muller.
Okay.
They find a volume of Najlat Schriften, which is basically posthumous writings.
Right.
And it's got a manuscript called Ethica of Zed Leer,
Interesting.
which basically means ethics or moral doctrine in Dutch.
I see.
And it's got a summary that's very similar to the one that Boehmer found.
Right.
And this Ethica Zed Leer seems to match up perfectly with the descriptions of this rumored lost ethics.
So mystery solved?
You would think, right?
Right.
But just as Van Vloten is finishing up his supplement,
Yeah.
this poet and jurist, Adrian Bogers, announces that he has a second manuscript.
Really?
Yeah, it's almost identical to the first one.
Wow.
But this one has a very clear title,
Oh.
Breve tratado de Deus do homem e do seu bem-estar.
Okay.
The short treatise on God, man, and his well-being.
So now we have a manuscript with an actual title.
Right, which is a huge step forward
It is.
in understanding what this work actually is.
Yeah.
So now there are two manuscripts, and things get really interesting.
Right. The debate heats up.
The scholarly debate really takes off,
The bet.
especially about what language the text was originally written in.
That makes sense.
So the big question is, did Spinoza write the Breve Tratado in Latin,
Okay.
and then someone translated it into Dutch,
Yeah.
or did he dictate it in Dutch to his friends and followers?
Right.
There are good arguments on both sides.
Okay, well, let's get into those.
Okay.
What were the main reasons that people thought it was dictated in Dutch?
Well, the people who thought it was dictated in Dutch,
Yes.
they pointed to this one part in the Nota,
Okay.
which suggests that Spinoza spoke the text out loud in Dutch
I see.
as a series of, informal lectures
Okay.
to his group of intellectuals,
Okay.
which is often called the Circle of Spinoza.
Right.
They also thought that the style of the text, which seems less structured, the fact that it includes dialogues in the first part,
Right.
and the fact that it has this geometric appendix added later,
Okay.
which some see as an attempt to organize the material more formally,
Right.
they thought that all of this supported the idea that it was originally an oral presentation that someone wrote down.
Okay, I can see that.
Yeah.
What about the counter arguments?
Yeah.
What were the reasons that some scholars thought it was originally in Latin?
Right. Well, those arguments were pretty strong.
Okay.
First of all, Spinoza himself said in some of his letters
Yeah.
that he had trouble writing in Dutch.
Ah.
He preferred Latin.
Interesting.
Second, when he was tutoring this student named Caesarius,
Okay.
he taught him philosophy in Latin.
Right.
And those lessons were later published in Latin
Okay.
as Principia Philosophiae Cartesianae and Cogitata Metaphysica.
Okay.
And even though the Nota mentioned this dictation idea,
Yeah.
at the end of the Breve tratado, Spinoza says that he wrote it for his friends. And he uses the word wrote, not dictated.
Okay. That's a good point.
Plus, the preface of manuscript A specifically says that the treatise
Yeah.
was written in Latin for his students
Okay.
and then translated into Dutch for anyone who loved truth.
Interesting.
And on top of that, when linguists looked closely at the Dutch text,
Yeah.
they found lots of Latinisms,
Sure.
which are Latin grammatical structures and vocabulary,
Okay.
that snuck into the Dutch, which really suggests that it was a translation.
Makes sense.
And then to top it all off, the preface to the volume that has manuscript A
Right.
clearly says that both the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus and the Breve Tratado
Okay.
were originally in Latin and then translated into Dutch.
So it seems like a lot of evidence points to the Latin original.
Yeah, pretty much all of it.
Okay.
The vast majority of scholars now agree that the Breve Tratado was originally written in Latin
Got it.
and most likely translated into Dutch by a friend,
Okay.
probably Johannes Boomeister or Peter Balling.
So it seems like the language debate is pretty much settled then.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, well, let's talk about the people who were copying and preserving these texts.
Yeah.
Who were these scribes?
Well, Antonius van der Linde did some really important work in 1865.
Okay.
He did a lot of linguistic analysis,
Yeah.
and he carefully compared handwriting
Right.
with manuscripts that we know were written by Spinoza.
Okay.
And through this work, he identified Johannes Monnikhoff,
Okay.
who was an Amsterdam surgeon,
A surgeon.
as the person who copied manuscript B.
Wow.
And he's probably the one who wrote the Nota and both versions of the Compendio Breve.
Wow. That's incredible.
There's even evidence that Monnikhoff added notes.
Like little side comments?
Yeah, marginal notes
Okay.
and grammar corrections to manuscript A.
So he was engaging with the text.
Yeah, it seems like he had access to it as well.
That's interesting. And why would he do all of this?
Well, the reasons are still kind of up for debate.
Okay.
One theory is that he copied Spinoza's work, maybe even decades later,
Okay.
to defend his friend, Willem Derhoff,
Interesting.
who had been accused of being a Spinozist
I see.
around 1743.
Okay.
The idea was maybe to show that Derhoff wasn't a true Spinozist.
By having a copy of the treatise.
Right, but some scholars don't think that either Monnikhoff or Derhoff were actually followers of Spinoza.
So the motivations are still a bit unclear.
Yeah, we don't know for sure.
Okay, so you've mentioned manuscripts A and B a few times now.
Right.
What are the main similarities and differences between them?
They have the exact same content.
Okay.
They're divided into two parts the same way with the same chapters.
Okay.
They both have two dialogues and two appendices.
Right.
They even have the same preface for part 2 and the same footnotes.
So they're very similar.
Yes, very much so.
But there must be some differences.
Well, manuscript A has two different handwritings in it.
Okay.
The original scribe from the 17th century used this really neat and consistent handwriting,
Okay.
a mix of Gothic and cursive scripts.
Interesting.
And then Monnikhoff came along later and added things,
Oh, I see.
like a portrait of Spinoza
Oh, wow.
and some poems and missing titles.
Okay.
Manuscript B, on the other hand,
Yeah.
was all copied by Monnikhoff,
Okay.
and it's thought to be from the 18th century.
Right, so it's a later copy.
Exactly. So because manuscript A is older and comes from the 17th century,
Right.
it's considered the authentic version, the Codex Unicus.
The primary source.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about how the Breve Tratado might be a less polished work
Yes.
than the ethics.
Right.
But you've also mentioned how important it is. Can you
Yeah.
explain that a little more?
Yeah, even though it doesn't have the super strict geometric structure
Right.
and formal presentation of the ethics,
Okay.
the Breve Tratado gives us this really valuable look into how Spinoza developed his core ideas.
I see.
It's like seeing an artist's early sketches
Right.
before they create the final masterpiece.
Gives you a sense of the process.
Exactly. And just like Revertz's son said, there were essentially two ethics.
Oh.
There was the superstructured Latin version that we all know,
Yeah.
and this earlier Dutch manuscript,
Okay.
which was kind of like the foundation
Yeah.
or the initial exploration of those same big concepts.
Okay, so it's important even though it's not the final polished version.
Exactly.
You also brought up this really interesting question
Yeah.
about the translation process.
Right.
Can you go into that a little bit more?
Well, It's kind of a puzzle.
Okay.
If the Breve Tratado was first written in Dutch,
Yeah.
why would someone go through the trouble of creating a Latin version
Right.
and then translating it back into Dutch?
Yeah, that seems strange.
Especially since it wasn't intended for a wide audience or for publication.
Like the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus was...
Right.
That was published in Spinoza's lifetime, right?
It was.
Okay, so that suggests maybe the Latin version was important for another reason.
Yeah, maybe it had a special purpose beyond just being a step towards the ethics.
Okay.
Makes you think about who Spinoza wanted to read it.
And why he chose those different languages.
Yeah, exactly.
This whole thing really shows us how secretive Spinoza's intellectual life was.
It really does.
It highlights how his ideas were spread, like a hidden network.
Yeah, exactly.
Spinoza's ideas were controversial.
Oh, very much so.
Right.
Very controversial in his time.
People were afraid of them.
They were seen as dangerous.
Yeah.
So his texts were often shared in secret among friends.
Right, like an underground movement.
Exactly. They were copied by hand and kept hidden.
Which makes sense considering the risks.
Absolutely. Jonathan is Israel. He's a historian.
Okay.
And he calls Spinoza the most significant intellectual challenger to the foundations of revealed religion and established political authority.
Wow, that's a big statement.
It is.
So possessing and sharing Spinoza's writings could get you in big trouble.
Yeah, definitely.
I can see why people are so interested in finding any of his lost works then.
Right, like that discovery in 2011.
Oh yeah, tell me about that.
They found a previously unknown Latin manuscript in the Vatican Library.
Really?
Yeah, it was related to the ethics.
That's amazing.
That just shows how impactful and relevant his thinking still is.
It does. It really does.
So all this considered, how many works do scholars actually think Spinoza wrote?
Right. What's the official count?
Right now, scholars are pretty confident that Spinoza wrote 8 major works.
Okay.
The Breve Tratado, the Ethics, and the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus.
Right.
Those are some of the big ones.
Yes. Very famous.
But he also wrote the Treatise on the Improvement of the Understanding,
Okay.
Principles of Cartesian Philosophy, Metaphysical Thoughts,
Yeah.
Political Treatise, and his Compendium of Hebrew Grammar.
Wow. He was prolific.
He was.
And we also have his letters, right?
We do. There are about 88 letters that we know of.
Interesting. So out of all those works, how many were actually published when he was alive?
Only 2 for sure.
Really?
The Principles of Cartesian Philosophy
Okay.
with the Metaphysical Thoughts as an appendix.
Right.
That came out in 1663.
Okay.
And the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus in 1670.
And the TTP was published anonymously, right?
It
To protect Spinoza.
Yeah, to protect him from any backlash.
Yeah, because it was controversial.
Very much so. They even used a fake imprint on it.
What do you mean?
They said it was published in Hamburg,
Okay.
but it was actually printed in Amsterdam
Oh, wow.
by Spinoza's friend and publisher, Jan Reerts.
Sneaky.
It was all very hush-hush.
I see.
And there's also this debated apologia.
Which is?
It's mentioned by this writer, Pierre Bayle.
Okay.
It was supposedly Spinoza's defense for why he left the synagogue.
Interesting.
And some people think it might have been his only work written in Portuguese.
Which was his native language.
Right. And then there's some other smaller pieces where scholars still debate whether Spinoza actually wrote them.
Makes sense.
So what happened to all his unpublished writings after he died in 1677?
Yeah, what happened to all that work?
Well, his close friends,
Yeah.
they gathered up all his remaining manuscripts
Okay.
and they published them after his death
Good for them.
in both Latin and Dutch.
Wow.
These were called the Opera Postuma in Latin
Okay.
and the Naturate Schriften in Dutch.
Got it.
These included the Ethics for the first time,
Wow, that's a big one.
yeah, as well as the Political Treatise
Okay.
and the Treatise on the Improvement of the Understanding,
Right.
and a bunch of letters, like 75 of them,
Wow.
and the Compendium of Hebrew Grammar.
But the compendium wasn't in the Dutch edition, right?
You're right, it wasn't.
Okay.
But the interesting thing is
Yeah.
that in the preface to the Opera Postuma,
Right.
the editors actually say that they think there are other smaller writings out there.
Really?
Yeah, they even mention a possible short piece about rainbows.
Interesting. So they knew there was more.
They did.
So then how did we get from there to the Breve Tratado?
All right, how did we get to this rediscovery?
Yeah.
It's a long journey.
I bet.
Unlike those other rumored lost works,
Right.
the Breve Tratado doesn't really show up in any historical records
Okay.
until the 19th century.
Wow, that's late.
It is, and according to this scholar, Charles Appin,
Okay.
the story begins with this German scholar,
Okay.
Christophorus Theophilus de Meur,
Okay.
who was doing research in the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
Right.
He was looking for Spinoza's Apologia,
That defense you mentioned.
Exactly.
Okay.
Hoping it would shed light on the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus.
Right.
He didn't find the Apologia,
Oh, too bad.
but he did find something
What was that?
that we now understand is the first clue about the Breve tratado.
Interesting.
In some papers that belong to Jan Riewerts's family.
Spinoza's publisher.
Right.
Okay.
He found Spinoza's Latin notes on the TTP. And in 1802, when he published these notes,
Yeah.
Murr said something really strange about the ethics.
Oh, what was that?
He claimed that it was originally written in Dutch
Okay.
and only later translated into Latin.
Right.
And that a chapter on the devil was left out of the Latin version.
That sounds familiar.
It does, doesn't it?
That same rumor.
Exactly. And Murr doesn't say where he got this information.
So where did it come from?
Well, the main source for this whole Dutch ethics idea
Yeah.
with the chapter on the devil
Right.
seems to be this guy Gottlieb Stoll.
Okay.
He went on this research trip to Holland
Okay.
with a guy named Hallman
Right.
in the early 1700s.
Okay.
They were trying to find out more about Spinoza
Yeah.
from people who knew him
Right.
or who could offer new insights.
Okay.
And that included meeting with Jan Riewerts's son.
Oh, wow.
Stoll kept a detailed record of this trip,
I see.
and parts of it were published later on.
Okay.
And his account of meeting Riewerts the Younger is super important.
For understanding how this confusion started.
Exactly. So Riewerts the Younger shows them this manuscript that
Okay.
his father had copied.
Okay.
But it was in Spinoza's handwriting.
Interesting.
It was the Ethics in Dutch,
Okay.
which is supposedly the language Spinoza wrote it in originally.
Okay.
And Riewerts the Younger says that this Dutch ethics
Yeah.
is structured very differently from the published Latin version. It's organized into chapters
Okay.
instead of following the strict geometric method.
Right.
And the arguments are presented more like a story,
I see.
similar to the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus.
Right.
He even says that while the printed Latin ethics is a better explanation,
Oh.
the Dutch manuscript has this unique 21st chapter
Oh, here we go.
called On the Devil,
Oh, wow.
where Spinoza supposedly talks about this spirit that's opposed to God.
Okay.
And according to Riewerts,
Yeah.
Spinoza ultimately denies that this spirit exists.
Interesting.
So Riewerts says that some of Spinoza's close friends made copies of this manuscript,
Okay.
but it was never printed
Why not?
because they thought the Latin edition was better
Right.
and more polished and systematic.
Okay, so it was considered the better version.
Exactly.
And this one conversation basically created decades of confusion.
It did.
Yeah, that's why.
Years later, in 1718,
Hmm.
Stoll publishes a book
Okay.
where he recounts this whole thing.
The conversation with Riewerts?
Yeah.
Okay.
And this information then gets included in all these important bibliographical works,
Which are?
like Ryman's Catalog of Theological Literature
Okay.
and Mylius's bibliography of anonymous and pseudonymous publications.
Right.
So for decades, the Breve Tratado is only known as this rumored Dutch ethics,
Okay.
with the infamous chapter on the devil.
Even though no one had actually seen it?
Right. No one who was alive at the time had seen the actual manuscript.
Wow, so this misinformation even affected later scholars.
It did, drawing on these references.
Yeah.
H.E. Gottlob Paulus, who was working on an edition of Spinoza's complete works
Okay.
in the early 19th century.
Yeah.
He said that the only major work missing by Spinoza
Yeah.
was part of the Ethics
Yeah.
that was originally in Dutch,
Right?
and he called it a supplementum ethices.
Interesting.
And he said that it would have dealt with the idea of evil.
I see.
And then later, in the 1840s,
Yeah.
this French philosopher Adolphe Franck,
Okay.
he literally quotes Mylius in his work.
Really?
Yeah, and he repeats this whole idea
Okay.
about an ethics manuscript
Yeah.
with a chapter about the devil.
That this devil chapter really had a hold on people.